The soft, low lights of the gilded fork always made the place feel like a secret. They caught the edges of the wine glasses and polished silverware, making them sparkle like tiny jewels. The air was thick with the good smells of roasted garlic, fresh bread, and simmering herbs. It was a fancy place, the kind where people came to feel important, and for the most part, they behaved themselves. Moving through it all was Clara. She was a ghost in a crisp white apron, her dark hair pulled back neatly in a bun. A small, polite smile was fixed on her face, a mask she had perfected over long, tiring hours. Her feet, hidden in sensible black shoes, ached in a way that had become a constant dull background to her life. Each night, she would go home and rub them. The soreness a reminder of the miles she walked between the kitchen and the dining tables to the customers. The girl who brought their food and refilled their water. They saw her quick, efficient movements, the way she could balance 3 plates on one arm without a wobble. They saw her nod and say, "Of course, right away, sir," and "Is everything to your liking, ma'am?" But they didn't see the girl who existed after her shift ended. They didn't see her in her tiny apartment, a place so small she could almost touch the kitchen sink from her bed. They didn't see the second-hand electric keyboard squeezed into the only corner it would fit, its wires snaking across the floor to a worn-out outlet. That was where Clara truly lived. In the quiet hours after midnight, when the whole city seemed to hold its breath, her fingers would find the keys. The cheap, unweighted plastic keys were a poor substitute for ivory, but they were her portal. They were her escape from the ache in her feet and the weight of the rent. She was saving every penny she could, every tip, every extra dollar, for a single purpose: to finish her studies at the city's music conservatory. The Gilded Fork was just a stopover, a necessary detour on the road to a stage, a concert hall, a life filled with music instead of the clatter of dishes. On this particular Tuesday night, the restaurant was buzzing with a comfortable midweek energy. Clara was in her zone, moving from table to table, her mind a calm, organized list of orders and requests. She had just dropped off a steaming bowl of pasta for a couple on a date, their eyes only for each other, and was on her way to the kitchen when the front door swung open with a sudden gust of cool night air. It wasn't just the temperature that changed. The whole feeling of the room shifted. Heads turned, just for a second, a collective, almost unconscious reaction. Standing there, framed in the doorway, was a man who seemed to suck up all the space around him. He was dressed in a suit that looked like it had been tailored to the exact millimeter of his body, the dark fabric shimmering slightly under the lights. He wasn't young, but he carried himself with the sharp, restless energy of someone who was used to the world bending to his will. He was flanked by 2 younger men in similar, though less impressive, suits, who laughed a little too loudly at something he had just said. The restaurant manager, a usually unflappable man named Mr. Davison, practically scurried from behind his podium. His professional smile was stretched a little too wide. "Mr. Sterling, welcome, welcome. A pleasure, as always. Your usual table is waiting for you." The man, Mr. Sterling, gave a curt nod, not even looking at the manager. His eyes swept the room, a predator surveying his territory. He and his associates followed the manager, their expensive shoes making soft, thudding sounds on the thick carpet that seemed to command silence. As they passed, conversations at nearby tables quieted down. People felt his presence, even if they didn't know who he was. It was an aura of pure, unapologetic wealth and power. And unfortunately for Clara, their journey ended at a large, circular booth right in the middle of her section. Clara took a deep, quiet breath, straightened her apron, and approached the table. Her practiced smile was ready. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Can I start you off with something to drink?" Mr. Sterling didn't even look up from the menu he was holding with a sort of disdainful curiosity. One of his associates, a man with a slicked-back hairstyle, started to order. But Mr. Sterling held up a hand, silencing him instantly. He finally lifted his gaze, but it didn't land on Clara's face. It landed somewhere just above her head, as if she were an object. He snapped his fingers. The sound was sharp and ugly in the quiet around their table. "Water," he said, his voice flat and demanding. and not that tap water you try to serve. I want bottled. San Pellegrino, ice cold. And bring 3 of them now. He looked back down at his menu. The conversation over as far as he was concerned, Clara felt a hot flush of embarrassment creep up her neck. The snap of his fingers felt like a small, sharp slap. She had been snapped at before, but it never got easier. It was a gesture meant to strip away her humanity, to remind her that in his world she was just a function. She swallowed the feeling down, burying it deep under years of practice. Of course, sir. Right away, she said, her voice remaining steady. She turned and walked toward the bar, her back straight, refusing to let them see her discomfort. She could feel their eyes on her, or rather she could feel Mr. Sterling's complete lack of interest in her as a person. As she waited for the bartender to pull the fancy bottles of water from the cooler, she heard a loud, booming laugh from the table. It was Mr. Sterling, telling a story, his voice carrying across the room. He was performing for his friends, and the entire restaurant was his unwilling audience. When she returned with the heavy, chilled bottles and glasses, the condescension continued. She poured the water carefully, but Mr. Sterling stopped her with a wave of his hand. That's enough, he said, though his glass was only half full. When she moved to the next one, he sighed, an exaggerated, weary sound. Honestly, is it so difficult? He muttered to his friend, just loud enough for her to hear. You'd think for the prices they charge here, they could hire staff who know how to pour a glass of water. The friend chuckled nervously. Clara's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She simply finished pouring, placed the bottle on the table, and asked, Are you ready to order, or do you need a few more minutes? Mr. Sterling finally deigned to give her his full attention, a thin, cruel smile playing on his lips. Oh, we're ready, he said, and then proceeded to order in the most complicated way possible, changing ingredients, demanding special preparations, and making it clear that he believed the kitchen existed solely to cater to his whims. Through it all, Clara just nodded and wrote, her pen scratching furiously on her notepad, her face a mask of calm professionalism. But inside, a storm was slowly starting to brew. After she put the order in, she had a few moments of respite. She leaned against the wall in the service hallway, closing her eyes for just a second. She pictured the keyboard in her room, imagined her fingers playing a complex, beautiful melody by Chopin. It was her sanctuary, the place where this man and his kind could not reach her. When she opened her eyes, she was back in the Gilded Fork. The main courses for Mr. Sterling's table were ready. She carefully arranged the plates on a large tray, the weight of it familiar on her shoulder, and made her way back to the lion's den. She served the food, placing each dish in front of the person who ordered it with a quiet, Enjoy your meal. Mr. Sterling immediately picked up his fork, poked at his specially prepared fish, and wrinkled his nose. It's a bit dry, he declared, though he hadn't even tasted it yet. But I suppose it will have to do. Clara simply nodded, her smile feeling more brittle than ever. She was refilling his water glass when her eyes, for just a moment, drifted across the room. In the far corner, bathed in its own soft pool of light, sat the restaurant's grand piano. It was a beautiful instrument, polished black wood that gleamed, its ivory keys looking pristine and untouched. It was mostly for decoration, a symbol of class and sophistication. Very rarely did anyone ever play it. But for Clara, it was more than just furniture. It was a beacon. Looking at it, she felt a familiar pang of longing so intense it was almost painful. She imagined sitting on that bench, the feel of the cool ivory under her fingers, the weight of the keys, the way the sound would fill this room. A sound so much more real and meaningful than the clinking of silverware or the arrogant laughter of wealthy men. For a brief second, her professional mask slipped. A wistful, dreamy expression softened her face. She wasn't a tired waitress in a stuffy restaurant. She was a pianist, looking at her stage. It was only for a second, but it was long enough. Mr. Sterling, who had been watching her with a bored, predatory gaze, saw the change in her expression. He saw her look at the piano, and a cruel, calculating light entered his eyes. He had been growing tired of his meal and his companions. He needed a new form of entertainment, and he had just found it. He saw a young, tired waitress, probably dreaming of a life she could never have. He saw an easy target. He leaned back in his chair, a smug, triumphant smile spreading across his face. He had found the perfect way to amuse himself at her expense. He cleared his throat, his voice suddenly booming across the immediate vicinity, loud enough to make the tables nearby fall silent. "You girl," he called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "Don't just stand there gawking." Clara stood frozen for a moment, the heavy tray still balanced on her shoulder. The man's voice, sharp and commanding, had cut through the low hum of the restaurant like a knife. "You girl, don't just stand there gawking. Come here." Every pair of eyes at the nearby tables had turned to look at her, then quickly away, pretending they hadn't heard. It was that awkward, silent dance people do when they witness something uncomfortable but don't want to get involved. She could feel their pity, and in a strange way, that was almost worse than the man's cruelty. She forced her feet to move one step at a time. Carrying her back to the table of doom, Mr. Sterling was leaning back in his plush booth, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. Like a cat that had just cornered a mouse. "Yes, sir," she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She kept her eyes fixed on the empty space just above his head, a trick she had learned to avoid the piercing, judgmental gaze of customers like him. He pointed a finger at his plate, where a piece of his specially prepared fish lay untouched. "This," he said, his voice dripping with disgust, "it is utterly tasteless. I thought this place was supposed to be good. I came here on a recommendation, but I see I was misled. I hadn't eaten more than 2 bites." Clara knew this was a power play. He wasn't complaining about the food. He was complaining about his own lack of control over the universe. And she was the easiest person to take it out on. "I'm very sorry to hear that." "Sir?" she said, the words coming out automatically, like a recorded message. "Would you like me to take it back and have the chef prepare something else for you?" He let out a short, sharp laugh, and have him spit in it. "No, thank you. Just take it away." He waved his hand dismissively. As she reached for the plate, he deliberately knocked his fork onto the floor. It clattered loudly against the polished hardwood. "Oops," he said, without a trace of apology. "Be a dear and get me a clean one." His friends chuckled, a weak, sycophantic sound. Clara bent down, her cheeks burning with a heat that had nothing to do with the restaurant's temperature. As she picked up the fork, she could feel the eyes of the entire room on her bent back. It was a small, deliberate act of humiliation, designed to make her feel small and insignificant. And it was working. She walked away, her head held high, but inside she felt like she was crumbling. Each little comment, each petty demand, was like a tiny chip being hammered away at her self-worth. She dropped the dirty fork in the bus tub and grabbed a clean one, her hand trembling slightly. She thought of her tiny apartment, of the keyboard waiting for her. She thought of the piece she was trying to master, a complicated and beautiful sonata that required all her focus and emotion. In that world, there was no place for rude men or fallen forks. There was only the music, the pure and perfect language of the soul. That thought gave her a small sliver of strength. She was not just a waitress. She was a musician. This job was just what she did. It was not who she was. When she returned with the new fork, Mr. Sterling was complaining again, this time about the wine. "It's too warm," he declared to his friend, loud enough for the manager, who was hovering a few feet away, to hear. You'd think for $100 a bottle they could at least serve it at the right temperature. The manager, Mr. Davison, scurried over, his face a mask of concern. "Of course, Mr. Sterling, right away. We can chill it for you." Mr. Davison gave Clara a quick, apologetic look, but it was a look of helplessness. He wasn't going to defend his staff. He was going to appease the wealthy customer no matter how unreasonable he was. It was the unwritten rule of the service industry, and Clara understood it perfectly. She was on her own. As Mr. Davison fussed over the wine, Clara took a step back, just for a breath, and that's when her eyes found the piano again. It was sitting there in the corner, so elegant and silent. It looked like it was waiting for her. She imagined the feel of the smooth, cool keys under her fingertips. She imagined the rich, full sound that would fill the room. A sound that could command attention in a way that was beautiful and true, not loud and bullying. She pictured herself playing the first few bars of the sonata, the notes flowing from her, telling a story of struggle and hope, of darkness and light. For a moment, she was lost in the fantasy. The tired waitress faded away, and in her place was the artist, the creator. A soft, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. It was a real smile, not the professional one she wore for her customers. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated longing. It was that smile that Mr. Sterling saw. He had just sent the manager away with the wine and was looking for his next source of amusement. His eyes landed on Clara, and he saw the change in her face. He saw the dreamy look in her eyes as she stared at the piano. He saw her not as a person, but as a prop for his evening's entertainment. A cruel idea began to form in his mind, a way to publicly puncture her little daydream and remind everyone, especially her, of their place in the world. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial loudness that was guaranteed to carry. "Well, well, well," he said, drawing the words out. "What have we here? Look at her, everyone." A few more heads turned. "Our little waitress is a dreamer." He gestured with his thumb toward the piano. "You think you're a star? Is that it? You think you can just look at that piano and somehow be able to play it?" His friends snickered. Clara's smile vanished, replaced by a cold dread. She knew what was coming. She had seen this kind of bullying before in school, on the playground. It was the same ugly game, just played with more expensive toys. She tried to turn away, to retreat to the safety of the kitchen, but his voice stopped her. "Don't walk away from me. I'm talking to you." He stood up, his large frame making the table feel small. He addressed the room now, not just her. "I have a proposition for you all. A little bit of fun for the evening." He had the full attention of the dining room now. The air grew thick and heavy with anticipation. He pointed a finger directly at Clara. "I bet this girl, this waitress who can't even pour a glass of water properly, can't play a single note on that piano. Not one." A wave of whispers washed through the restaurant. People were leaning in, their meals forgotten. This was better than a show. Mr. Sterling was enjoying every second of it. He could feel the power surging through him. The power to command a room and to ruin someone's evening with just a few words. He pulled a thick wallet from his suit pocket and fanned out a collection of $100 bills. "I'll make it interesting," he boomed. "I will bet you $1,000. Right here, right now. You go over to that piano and you play one simple song. Anything Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star would be a good start. If you can do it, this cash is yours." He slapped the money down on the table with a loud thud. "But if you can't," he added, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl, "you have to admit to everyone in this room that you're just a nobody who is daydreaming about a life you'll never have." The challenge hung in the air, ugly and sharp. It wasn't a real bet. It was a trap. If she refused, she would look like a coward, and he would mock her for that. If she accepted and failed, he would have his public humiliation. The smirks on his friends' faces told her everything she needed to know. They were in on the joke. She looked around the room and saw a mix of emotions. Some people looked uncomfortable, staring down at their plates. Others looked on with morbid curiosity, eager to see the outcome. The manager was pale, his hands clasped together, as if in prayer, but he was rooted to the spot, afraid to intervene. Clara felt her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The blood was rushing in her ears, drowning out the sounds of the restaurant. All she could see was the pile of money on the table and the cruel, expectant face of the man who had put it there. The world had shrunk to just the two of them and the silent, gleaming piano in the corner. The silence that followed Mr. Sterling's challenge was heavy and suffocating. It was a thick, uncomfortable blanket that smothered the usual clatter and chatter of the restaurant. Clara could feel 100 pairs of eyes on her, their gazes like tiny, sharp needles pricking at her skin. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, and her hands felt cold and clammy. A part of her, the sensible, self-preserving part, screamed at her to just walk away, to go to the manager, to say she wasn't feeling well, to do anything to escape this public arena of humiliation. She could imagine the smug victory on Mr. Sterling's face. Condescending way he would let her go, as if he were doing her a favor. The thought made her stomach churn with a hot, bitter mix of fear and anger. But then another feeling began to rise up from deep inside her. quiet but powerful current pushing back against the tide of fear. It was the memory of countless nights spent in her small apartment, her fingers aching, her mind exhausted from a long shift, but still forcing herself to practice. She remembered the frustration of a difficult passage, the joy of finally getting it right, the way a simple melody could wash away the fatigue and the dirt of the day. This man, with his expensive suit and his cruel smile, knew nothing about that. He saw a waitress in a cheap uniform, an easy target for his amusement. He didn't see the hours of dedication, the sacrifices, the sheer love that fueled her dream. He was trying to take that away from her, to stomp on it in front of a room full of strangers. And in that moment, Clara knew she couldn't let him. It wasn't about the $1,000 anymore. It was about something much, much more. It was about the part of her that she kept hidden, the part that was a musician. With a slow, deliberate movement that felt surprisingly calm, Clara reached behind her back and untied the strings of her apron. She pulled it over her head and folded it neatly, placing it on the arm of an empty chair near the kitchen entrance. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. She was shedding the skin of the waitress, the person they thought they knew. A murmur went through the crowd. They hadn't expected this. They had expected her to mumble an excuse and flee. Mr. Sterling's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had been looking forward to her cowardice. Clara didn't look at him. She didn't look at anyone. She just began to walk. Her steps were quiet and sure on the thick carpet. The room seemed to part for her, creating a clear path to the corner where the piano waited. It felt like the longest walk of her life. She could feel the weight of every stair, but she kept her eyes fixed on her destination. The grand piano looked almost majestic in the soft light, a silent, black sentinel. As she got closer, she could see her own faint reflection in its polished surface, a tired-looking girl in a simple, white shirt and black skirt. But she didn't see a tired girl. She saw a performer approaching her stage. She reached the bench and ran her hand lightly over its smooth, dark wood. Then she sat down. The posture of her body changed instantly. Her back straightened, her shoulders relaxed, and her chin lifted slightly. She was no longer the hunched-over, weary waitress. She was a pianist. She gently caressed the keys, her fingers hovering over them for a moment, a silent greeting to an old friend. The ivory felt cool and familiar under her touch. She closed her eyes for just a second, took a deep, steadying breath, and let the world fall away. The restaurant, the people, the cruel man, the bedit, all faded into a distant hum. There was only her and the music. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play. The first few notes were soft, slow, and full of a deep, haunting sadness. It wasn't twinkle, twinkle, little star. It was something else entirely, something complex and full of emotion. The melody was like a story being told in a low, mournful voice, a tale of longing and loss. The initial smirks and curious whispers in the room died instantly. People who had been leaning forward in anticipation of a fumble now leaned back, their expressions shifting from mockery to rapt attention. The sound of the piano was unlike anything they had ever heard in this restaurant. It wasn't background music. It was the main event. It was raw, it was real, and it was beautiful. Mr. Sterling's face was a picture of confusion. He had expected a clumsy, embarrassing performance. He had planned his laughter, his next cruel comment. But this was something he couldn't control. He looked around the room and saw that he had lost his audience. They were no longer on his side. They were hers, captured completely by the spell she was weaving with her music. His associates had stopped chuckling, and were now staring at the young woman at the piano with their mouths slightly agape. Clara's fingers moved with a grace and confidence that seemed to belong to a different person. The music began to build, growing slowly in volume and speed. The sadness in the melody started to be tinged with a flicker of defiance, a hint of passion. Her body began to sway slightly with the rhythm, her eyes closed, lost in the world of the composition. She wasn't just pressing keys. She was pouring her soul into the instrument. Every note she played was a response to the challenge, a silent but powerful rebuttal to the man who had tried to humiliate her. The music was her voice, and it was speaking volumes. Then, without warning, the mood shifted again. The slow, mournful melody exploded into a flurry of sound. It was like a storm had suddenly broken loose inside the piano. Her fingers became a blur, flying across the keys with an incredible speed and precision that was almost breathtaking. The notes came cascading down, a torrent of fast, intricate, powerful music that filled every single corner of the restaurant. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated joy and fury, a celebration of life and talent. The room was utterly, completely silent now. The only sound, the thunderous, magnificent music coming from the piano. A waiter who had been on his way to a table froze mid-stride. A tray of drinks held perfectly still in his hands. A couple on a date stopped holding hands, their eyes wide with wonder as they watched the performance. People at the farthest tables craned their necks to see the source of this incredible sound. A few people quietly pulled out their phones, not to mock, but to capture something magical. Something they knew they would never see or hear again. They were recording a waitress playing a piano in a way that would have been impressive in a grand concert hall, let alone a Tuesday night at a bistro at the table of doom. The atmosphere had turned to ice. Mr. Sterling was ashen-faced, his smug expression completely gone, replaced by a look of stark, utter shock. He was watching a young woman he had tried to crush, and she was soaring. He had handed her a public platform for her own humiliation, and she had turned it into a stage for her triumph. The power he had felt just minutes ago had evaporated, leaving him feeling small and foolish. His associates stared at him, then back at the pianist, their faces a mixture of awe and pity for their boss. He had been utterly and completely upstaged, not by words or arguments, but by a raw, beautiful talent he could never hope to possess or understand. Clara played on, lost in the music. The fast-paced, exhilarating part of the piece reached its peak, a dizzying, breathtaking display of skill and passion. It was a musical declaration of her worth, a loud, clear, and undeniable statement that she was not just a waitress, not just a nobody. She was an artist. And as she struck the final, powerful chord, the sound seemed to hang in the air for a long, dramatic moment, ringing with truth and beauty. Then there was silence. A profound, breathtaking silence that was even more powerful than the music that had preceded it. No one moved. No one spoke. The entire room was holding its breath, collectively stunned by what they had just witnessed. It was a perfect, sacred moment, a shared experience of awe that connected everyone in the room, from the busboys to the wealthiest patrons. And in the center of it all was Clara, her fingers resting on the keys, her chest heaving. Her eyes still closed, basking in the afterglow of her own creation. The silence that followed the final, echoing chord was a living thing. It was heavy and full, pressing down on everyone in the room. It wasn't an empty silence. It was packed with the ghost of the music that had just filled the space, a silence so profound that it felt louder than any noise. For a long, drawn-out moment, no one moved. Waiters stood frozen, diners forgot how to chew, and the clinking of ice and glasses had completely ceased. Every single person was held captive by the aftershock of what they had just witnessed. Clara sat at the piano, her fingers still resting on the keys, her eyes closed. She was slowly coming back to herself, like a diver rising from the crushing pressure of the deep sea. The world of the music was fading, and the real world was seeping back in. She could feel the ache in her shoulders, the dryness in her throat, and the thundering of her own heart. Then, from the back of the room, a single person started to clap. It was one slow, deliberate clap, followed by another and another. It was an older man, a distinguished-looking gentleman with silver hair who was dining alone. He was on his feet, a look of pure reverence on his face. His solo applause was a catalyst. It was like a single spark in a dry forest. Another person joined in, then a couple more. Suddenly, the dam broke. The silence was shattered by an explosion of sound. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was a roar. It was a wave of pure, unadulterated appreciation that washed over Clara, so powerful it almost knocked the breath out of her. People were on their feet all over the restaurant. They were applauding her, the quiet waitress. With a passion usually reserved for rock stars or opera legends, Clara's eyes flew open. She saw a sea of faces, all turned towards her, their expressions a mixture of awe, joy, and disbelief. A wave of dizziness washed over her. This wasn't her small apartment with a second-hand keyboard. This was real. The applause was for her. A hot, stinging feeling pricked the back of her eyes, and she quickly blinked it away. She felt a strange, overwhelming mix of emotions, pride, relief, shock, and a deep, profound gratitude. She had been so afraid, and she had let the music take over. She hadn't thought about the notes or the technique. She had just played from the heart, pouring all her frustration, her dreams, and her soul into the instrument. And the people had understood. They had heard her. The manager, Mr. Davison, was the first to reach her. He pushed through the small crowd that was starting to gather around the piano, his face pale and his eyes wide. Clara. Clara, that was... I have no words, he stammered, his usual, unflappable composure completely gone. That was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard in this restaurant. In any restaurant, he was looking at her not as an employee, but as a phenomenon. The shift in his attitude was immediate and total. I am so sorry about that. That man, please let me make it up to you. A bonus. A big one. No, you don't have to work tomorrow night. Or the rest of the week. Paid, of course. Whatever you want. Clara just shook her head, unable to find her voice. She was still trying to process the fact that she was the center of this storm of applause. She looked over at the table where Mr. Sterling had been sitting. The scene there was a stark contrast to the celebration happening around the piano. Mr. Sterling was still in his seat, but he looked like a statue carved from ash. His face was a sickly grayish color, the smugness completely wiped away, replaced by a raw, naked humiliation. He was no longer the powerful predator. He was the prey, and the entire restaurant was the witness to his defeat. He saw the way people were looking at him when they weren't looking at Clara. They weren't just ignoring him. They were looking at him with a quiet, undisguised contempt. He had tried to publicly shame a young woman, and she had responded with a display of grace and talent that had made him look like a small, cruel fool. His associates were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, pointedly not looking at him. They were trying to make themselves invisible, to distance themselves from the man who had orchestrated this disaster. The pile of $100 bills was still on the table, but it no longer looked like a symbol of his power. It looked like a pathetic, failed bribe. It was the price of his own humiliation. Suddenly, Mr. Sterling couldn't take it anymore. He stood up so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly against the floor, a harsh grating sound in the midst of the applause. He didn't say a word. He just fumbled in his suit pocket, pulled out a thick wad of cash that was far more than the bill, and threw it on the table. The money scattered, some of it fluttering to the floor. He then turned and practically fled, his walk a fast, stiff-legged shuffle of shame. His friends scrambled to follow him, tripping over themselves in their haste to escape the scene of his public undoing. They didn't even look back. As the humiliated party made their escape, the applause for Clara only grew louder. People were now cheering, shouting bravo. An encore. A few of the other servers were looking at her with newfound respect, their smiles genuine and warm. A young woman at a nearby table caught Clara's eye and gave her a thumbs up, her face beaming. The entire atmosphere of the restaurant had been transformed. It was no longer a place of quiet, stuffy elegance. It was filled with a raw, vibrant energy, shared joy that had been born from one person's incredible talent and courage. Clara finally managed to stand up, her legs feeling a little shaky. The manager was still there, hovering protectively. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice full of genuine concern. "Can I get you some water?" Clara nodded, her throat still too tight to speak. She felt a gentle hand on her shoulder and turned to see the older gentleman who had started the applause. He had a kind, wrinkled face and eyes that twinkled with intelligence. "My dear," he said, his voice soft but firm, "you have a very special gift. Please, do not ever let anyone make you feel like you should hide it." His words were simple, but they hit Clara with the force of a revelation. All this time, she had been hiding her talent, treating it like a secret to be practiced in the dark. Tonight, for the first time, she had shared it with the world, and the world had embraced her. She looked around the room again. The applause was finally starting to die down, but the buzz of excited conversation was taking its place. People were talking about her, about the music, about the incredible turn of events. She saw a few people putting their phones away, and she realized with a jolt that many of them had been recording. A strange feeling bubbled up in her chest, a mix of fear and excitement. Her performance, her private moment of defiance and triumph, was no longer just a memory. It was out there, captured in pixels and sound waves, ready to be shared. She didn't know what that meant yet, but she knew with absolute certainty that her life had just changed. The man who had tried to break her had accidentally set her free. The quiet waitress from the Gilded Fork had just had her debut, and the world was listening. The ride home that night was a blur. Clara sat in the back of a taxi, the city lights smearing into streaks of color outside the window. The manager had insisted on paying for it, his apologies and offers of money and promotions still ringing in her ears. She had barely said a word, just nodded and accepted the ride, her mind too full to process it all. When she finally stepped into her tiny apartment, the silence felt deafening after the noise and emotion of the restaurant. She dropped her keys on the small table by the door and just stood there for a long moment, the events of the evening replaying in her mind like a movie. The cruel smirk on Mr. Sterling's face, the challenge hanging in the air, the feeling of her fingers on the piano keys, and then the roaring applause. It felt like it had happened to someone else. She walked over to the corner where her second-hand keyboard sat. In the dim light of her apartment, it looked small and pathetic compared to the grand piano at the Gilded Fork. She ran a finger over its plastic keys, a sad smile touching her lips. All those hours she had spent here, dreaming of a moment like tonight. And now that it had happened, it felt surreal, like a dream she might wake up from at any moment. She was exhausted, not just in her body, but in her soul. She fell into bed, still fully dressed, and was asleep almost before her head hit the pillow, the echo of the final chord still resonating in her mind. The next morning, she was woken up, not by her alarm, but by the relentless buzzing of her phone on the nightstand. It was a constant, irritating vibration. She groaned and rolled over, fumbling for it. The screen was lit up with a flood of notifications. Dozens of missed calls, hundreds of text messages, and thousands of social media alerts. Her heart started to pound. What was going on? The first text was from a friend she hadn't spoken to in months. It just said, "Oh my God, are you the waitress from the video?" Confused, Clara clicked on the link her friend had sent. The video started to play, filmed shakily on a phone from a table across the room. She saw herself standing by the table, the look of dread on her face as Mr. Sterling issued his challenge. She watched herself walk to the piano, sit down, and then the music began. The title of the video, which had already been shared thousands of times, was simple and powerful. Waitress shuts down rude customer with epic piano performance. She scrolled through the comments as her mind struggled to catch up. "This gave me goosebumps," one read. "That girl has more talent in her pinky finger than that rich jerk has in his whole body," said another. "Someone give this girl a record deal already." The view count was climbing at an astonishing rate, jumping by hundreds every time she refreshed the page. It was real. The performance, the applause, the humiliation of Mr. Sterling, it was all out there for the whole world to see. A wave of panic washed over her, followed by a strange, thrilling current of excitement. Her secret was out. Her music was out there, flying on its own wings. She spent the next hour in a daze, returning calls and texts from friends and family who had seen the video. Everyone was ecstatic, congratulating her, amazed by her hidden talent. She was still trying to process it all when her phone rang again. This time, it was a number she didn't recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail, but something made her answer. "Hello?" she said, her voice still a little shaky. "Hello, am I speaking with Clara?" The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and older. "Yes. This is Clara. My name is Dr. Alistair Finch. I am the head of the piano department at the city's Conservatory of Music. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The conservatory. The place she dreamed of attending? I saw a video of your performance last night, he continued. I must say I was utterly captivated. Not just by your technical skill, which is formidable, but by the emotion you poured into the list. It was a truly remarkable performance, especially under such challenging circumstances. Clara was speechless. She just held the phone, her mind racing. I understand you are a student here, albeit on a leave of absence due to financial constraints, Dr. Finch said. The conservatory would like to formally offer you a full scholarship. We will cover your tuition, your books, and a living stipend so you can focus entirely on your studies. We believe you have a rare and special gift, Clara, and we want to help you nurture it. A full scholarship. The words echoed in her mind. It was the answer to a prayer she hadn't even dared to speak out loud. The weight of years of worry about money, about having to choose between her dream and paying rent, suddenly lifted off her shoulders. Tears welled up in her eyes, but this time they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. Yes, she finally managed to choke out. Yes, of course. Thank you. Thank you so much. The call ended, and Clara sank to her floor, her phone slipping from her grasp. She thought it couldn't get any better than this. Her dream was coming true. But just a few hours later, her phone rang again. This time, it was a talent scout from the city's Philharmonic Orchestra. He had also seen the video. He talked about exposure, about connecting with an audience, about raw, natural talent. He offered her a chance. Not a job, not yet, but a chance to perform as a guest soloist with the orchestra at their upcoming weekend gala concert. It was a chance to play on a real stage with a full orchestra behind her. It was a chance that most musicians waited a lifetime for in the weeks that followed. Clara's life transformed at a speed that was dizzying. She quit her job at the Gilded Fork, where the staff now treated her like a celebrity. She moved out of her tiny apartment and into a dorm room at the conservatory, a space filled with light and the constant, comforting sound of other musicians practicing. She spent her days in intense lessons with Dr. Finch, who pushed her to explore the depths of her talent. He didn't just teach her notes. He taught her how to tell a story with music, how to find the emotion hidden in every phrase. The night of the gala concert arrived. Clara stood backstage, peeking through the heavy velvet curtains at the grand concert hall. It was a world away from the Gilded Fork. The seats were filled with people who had come specifically to hear her play. She was wearing an elegant, simple black dress, and her hands felt cool and steady. She wasn't the scared waitress anymore. She was a pianist. An announcer called her name, and the hall erupted in warm, welcoming applause. She walked out onto the stage, the lights bright in her eyes, sat at the gleaming black concert grand piano. She took a deep breath and placed her fingers on the keys. She decided to play the same piece she had played that night in the restaurant, Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2, as she began to play. She thought about the man who had tried to humiliate her. She didn't feel anger or bitterness anymore. She felt a strange sense of gratitude. He had been the villain in her story, but he had also been the unlikely catalyst. He had pushed her into a corner, and in that corner she had found her voice. The music that filled the grand hall that night was not a cry of defiance, but a statement of pure, confident joy. It was the sound of a dream that was no longer a secret, but a reality, shared with the world. And as her fingers danced across the keys, she knew, with a certainty that filled her entire being, that this was just the beginning.